Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We've got the live stream going now, so we should get started. So thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to the people on the live stream for tuning in. Just before I introduce our speaker for today, Zach Spicer, for the people who are here, I just wanted to kind of explain how the next little bit is going to go. So Zach's going to do his talk for an hour or so. There's a lot of food here, so don't hesitate to help yourself if you empty your plate during the talk to get a refill. But then after Zach's done his talk, so around 1 o'clock, we'll also have some time for the fall social. So basically we'll just sort of chat and mingle amongst ourselves, the people who are here. There are some instructors here, Martin and Chris, who you may not have met yet, so and Carol as well. That'll give you a chance to do that. So yeah, we'll probably just stick around for a bit after, kind of as long as people want to be here, and then but I know that a lot of the students have some work to do for Zach's class later today, so we also don't want to keep you guys too long either. So yeah, that's basically how the next hour and a half, I guess hour and a half to 2 hours is going to unfold. But now I guess to the topic at hand, I'm very happy to introduce and welcome Zach Spicer here today to give a talk on Uber's sort of entrance or intrusion into 10 North American cities, right? A topic I know that people in the city of Toronto, for example, are still kind of grappling with, even though the bylaw is in place. So I've known Zach, I guess, since we started here in 2009, doing our PhD together. Zach has always been, a hard worker and really on top of things, so he graduated. I think he was the first one among our cohort to graduate. Since then, he's kept quite busy. He's had a couple postdocs, published extensively on intermunicipal cooperation, city-county separation, and then in other areas as well, economic development, multi-level governance, among others. So currently, Zach is teaching a couple courses in the program here for us. He's teaching local government management this fall. He's teaching the theories course this fall and then local government management in the winter. And he also holds a number of positions in the Toronto area. So he's a fellow at the Institute of Municipal Finance and Governance, and this is the one I need to look up. He's also a senior associate with the Innovation Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs. So please join me in welcoming Zach, and we'll turn things over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for that very warm introduction. I really do appreciate it. So as Joe mentioned when we doing today is talking about Uber. Like most of us, myself and my co-authors have been quite interested in Uber. Uber is something that's hard to miss. So we decided that we would begin to research Uber's entry into a number of different markets a little more thoroughly. Those co-authors, I should mention, because I for some reason forgot to put their names or anyone's name upon this intro slide, are Gabriel Edelman from the School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Toronto, and Austin Zwick, also at UT, but in the Department of Geography. And Gabe and Austin and I were looking at Uber and looking at some of the research out there, and we're of course not the only ones conducting research on Uber or other platform economy services. But we were noticing a lot of the existing research looked at the labor aspect of Uber, some of the legal aspects of Uber. Uber, of course, finds itself into a lot of different lawsuits, issues about fairness, and various issues. But the one issue that we thought was really interesting was the regulatory aspect, right? The regulation of taxi cabs is something that's always been firmly in the control of local government. This is something that that has a long history, and these are closed markets. These are tightly regulated markets, and Uber, within a couple of years, found its way into hundreds of them. And these are markets that have been closed for over a century or close to a century, and have resisted other intrusions. But Uber seemed to have no problem breaking in. The easy answer here, of course, is that it's the technology. And the technology is new, it's innovative. It was something that the cab industry wasn't doing. But to us, there was a little bit more to the story. There was some strategy at play here. So we decided that we would look at this a little more deeply. So before I get started, I just want to say this, that the invitation to speak here today couldn't be more timely. The three of us have presented this paper at a number of different conferences, APSA, CPSA, and every single time it's been revised based on feedback that we've gotten. So we've just completed the latest revision of this work. I mentioned that simply to say this is a work in progress still. So we welcome any feedback you have, questions, comments, concerns. We're still trying to make sense of this ourselves. So if you have anything that you think that we've missed or any suggestions or comments, we certainly welcome them. So let me just start off by saying too that Uber is a bit of a moving target as a research subject. Uber's history has been a lot of ups and downs. The last year has probably had more downs than ups. The year started off with allegations of sexual misconduct and sexual harassment at Uber's corporate offices. It's continued to allegations that Uber had covered up instances of sexual assault by some of its drivers. With a lot of the blame for this kind of rested on Travis Kalanick's shoulders. Travis Kalanick was the founder and CEO of Uber, and he got into a number of different public spats with drivers over pay and stuff like that. He was unable to control some of the media narrative around the number of lawsuits that Uber was facing, and he was forced to resign, or chose to resign. Who knows if that actually worked out, but either way, he was out, and we're sort of left with probably the most Uberish headline imaginable. Uber's search for a female CEO has been narrowed down to 3 men, which gives you kind of a view into their corporate culture. Right, so with that said, our work is more of a snapshot in time, right? So we don't really cover the last year. We're looking at Uber's early history, right? And how they broke into several different markets around the world. So just on Uber itself, Uber is of course a massive company. It's seen as one of the darlings of the tech world, or if you talk to some, probably one of the bad boys of the tech world. It started in 2009. It's in very humble beginnings. It's simply an app that would connect you with other licensed cab drivers. And avoided you for having to stand and actually physically hail a cab on the street. And since then, it's spread to over 500 cities. They've offered new product lines, Uber Black, Uber X. You can even rent boats and stuff through them now in certain cities. It's just wild. Uber Eats is their new one. But throughout all this, has a $63 billion valuation. This, of course, is going to be rigorously tested as they move closer towards a IPO, which is apparently happening quite soon. But this growth has been nothing short of remarkable, right? Especially as I mentioned, that they are entering closed taxi marketplaces, right? And they've quickly gone through so many of them. Our question, of course, is how did this end up being, right? Technology, of course, is one answer, but we think there's more to this. So looking at Uber's regulatory approach, it's tough to sort of pin them down, right? So on the bottom here, we have Uber's latest controversy in London, England, right? They were allowed to operate, there were regulations in place. The city reluctantly embraced them, I guess, right? They were there, people wanted it. And as a result, they allowed Uber to operate. They since stripped Uber of its license to operate. And Uber is now vowing to appeal and fight this. They're still operating there pending appeal, but they very much want to stay in London. Closer to home, In Quebec, another jurisdiction that has kind of reluctantly embraced Uber, Uber is now leaving because the province wants them to adhere to a similar set of rules as the existing taxi industry. Namely rules around driver training and driver safety and things like that. So while the city is saying we will work with you, but you have to, while the province is saying we will work with you, but you have to work with us, Uber is saying no, we're gone, right? In Austin, right, there was a local referendum about having ride-sharing firms accept certain rules around driver training. Uber lost this campaign and subsequently left. Right? And then we have places like Innisfil, just south of Barrie, where Uber is standing in place of a transit system. Right? So Innisfil is probably about 30,000 people. They're on the cusp of needing some form of public transit. And one option there, of course, is to start a bus service, right? But instead of doing that, they've chosen to partner with Uber and subsidize Uber rides to certain parts of the community. So we get a sort of a hodgepodge of responses, and these are only 4. We have places that embrace Uber with open arms, places that partner with Uber, places that completely reject Uber, places that want nothing to do with them, places that kind of want something to do with them, but they have to play ball. So this is hard to kind of pin down, right? And we set out with the goal of trying to bring some order to this regulatory approach that seems kind of chaotic on Uber's part. So before we get into that, I think it's important just to talk a bit about the history of the cab market. Okay, so throughout history, throughout the recent history, I guess, the taxi market has been closed off. Right, look at almost every market around the world, and this is done for particular reasons. If you were to try to get a driver, sort of in the late sort of 1800s, early 1900s, there was a chance that person could pose a danger to you, right? They could pose as a legitimate driver. In some cases, you could be taken to the edge of town, robbed or hurt or something along those lines. These were dubbed bandit cabs. All right, so cities began to license drivers, right, as a way to ensure public safety. Right, so if you were unfamiliar with the city, you would get off a train station or something, and you would see a license, and there was some indication that that particular driver, was vetted by the city in some shape or form. Right, that there was some way that you could tell that the chances of you being hurt, assaulted, robbed, whatever, were low, or much lower than a unlicensed cab. So over time, regulation got added to regulation and added to more, and we began to focus on things like consumer protection. Right, we introduced meters to make sure that drivers couldn't rip off certain people, namely tourists. Right, we introduced things like flat rates. Right, so if you were going to the airport, you could have a flat rate. Right, so we were concerned about passenger safety, driver safety, and of course consumer protection. One of the hallmarks of all this is a cap on licenses. So most cities around the world had some form of cap on taxi licenses. So they could say that we're only going to have 1,000 cab drivers in this city, or 1,000 people licensed to drive a cab in our city. And as a result, you couldn't simply buy any sort of taxi license from the city. Right? You would have to purchase that through a private sale. So while the city may have sold these for, say, $500 or something, because they're capped, you can't buy them from them. In some cases, it was upwards of $1 million to buy a cab license. So people became hugely invested in the taxi system. So Uber's entry into some of these marketplaces, they weren't just disrupting existing policies, right? They were messing with people's huge investments, right? People are massively invested into these systems, sometimes taking out loans as big as mortgages just for the right to drive a cab. Uber completely devalued all of that. So Uber, of course, is a new market, is a new entrant to a rather crowded and tightly regulated marketplace. The cab industry is unique to the degree that it is closed and regulated, but there are certainly other tightly regulated marketplaces around the world in other industries. And if you are one of these established firms within these marketplaces, you of course do not take kindly to new firms entering your space, right? Whether it's tightly regulated or not, right? New firms with new products, new services are a potential threat to you. So if it's tightly regulated, you can lean on your relationship with existing institutional regulators and basically argue that this new product or this new service is disruptive to the marketplace as a whole, or potentially poses dangers and safety risks to consumers. Right? People could be harmed if this product is allowed to operate freely in the marketplace. So, with that said, if on the other side, if you are one of these new firms, you don't want to position or frame your product as something that is wholly disruptive. Right? You don't want to play into the framing of existing firms, right? So you'd say we're not disruptive, we're complementary, right? We complement the existing offerings in this marketplace, right? And then once you're able to get a toehold, you use public support. Those customers who like your product, and you use that to apply leverage to regulators to allow you to essentially stay within this marketplace. And over time, you can build support amongst politicians as well, and eventually seek regulatory approval. So that's a bit of a pathway forward. But like I mentioned, the cab industry is somewhat unique. But Uber isn't just a market disruptor; it's also a policy disruptor. Right. So with Uber, we have something unique, right? That not every market disruption requires a regulatory response, right? So when I was a student here many years ago, down the corner of Richmond and Oxford, there was a Blockbuster video, right? And if you talk to many of the undergrad students here today, you tell them that we used to march down to the Blockbuster, pick out a DVD, rent it, go home, watch it, then march back down and return it. They would think that's silly, right? That whole thing is just weird, right? Most people point to Netflix as the reason why there is no more Blockbuster, right? Why Blockbuster was forced into bankruptcy, and there's now I think it's an Urban Outfitters or something in the same building where a Blockbuster once prominently stood. So the issue there, of course, is that Netflix and other streaming services are a market disruptor, but they don't require a unique policy response. Maybe there's some copyright issues there, but we don't have to rewrite rules simply because Netflix has achieved some measure of market dominance. So with that said, let's turn to some of our cases. So Gabe and Austin and I, we decided that we would examine 10 North American alpha cities: New York, Chicago, Toronto, Los Angeles, Mexico City, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., Boston, and Atlanta. Examine the relationship between regulators and Uber. So let's get into some of this here. So in all of these cities, Uber launched in defiance of local bylaws. There was nothing on the books to describe as a particular service that Uber was offering. So then, when it was born in 2009, Uber was simply called Uber Cab, and it was a much more simpler service. It was an app on your phone that you could use to hail a licensed cab driver. So instead of standing out on a corner and waving for someone, or to actually call a cab dispatch service, you'd simply use your phone and it would hail the closest licensed cab. So to those who founded Uber Cab, they thought that this wasn't anything that was very disruptive, right? This was something that was just a new way of getting a cab, right? We're not adding new cabs, we're not adding new drivers, we're simply making it easier to facilitate a transaction that's been going on for close to 100 years or so, right? They soon spread to San Francisco. So from their home city in San Francisco, they soon spread to New York, Chicago, and Boston. They introduced other services such as Uber Black, which is essentially a black car service. So they begin to enter the taxi and limo industry a bit more. And then they finally introduced Uber X. Uber X is kind of what we more commonly associate with Uber today, which is where someone in a private vehicle will pick you up and drive you somewhere, and the Uber app facilitates that transaction, handles the money, directions, stuff like this. And as a result, they take a portion of the fee. If you talk to drivers, it's too much of a portion. But anyways, so when they introduced Uber X, this is when problems really begin to happen. So in 8 of our 10 cities, in 8 of the 10 cities we studied, they responded with court orders, fines, and outright bans. So again, Uber Cab didn't think they were doing anything that was all that new, right? They argued that they weren't really a cab service at all. Most of these cities argued that at the very least, they were a dispatch service, which requires a license. But they said, we're not really a cab company or a dispatch company, we're a technology company, and as a result, we are different. It's tough to argue that you're not a cab company when the word cab is in your name. So Uber Cab simply becomes Uber as a response. With that said, these cities are not buying it, right? They're not buying it. They are a tech firm only, and they're not a cab service. So each of these cities responds in a different way. We get cease and desist orders in San Francisco and Los Angeles, a legal injunction in New York and Toronto. We get fines in Chicago, Atlanta, and Miami, and we get an outright ban in Boston. So despite all of this, Uber continues to operate. They eventually developed technology that detects government credit cards and smartphones. They call it Grayball. It's something that they're currently in court for still. But they essentially created a system where it would send a ghost cab. So essentially it would tell these people that Uber is still coming, and it would make them wait for extended period of time, as opposed to say that they were denied from using the service. They would sort of fool them a bit, right? So bylaw officers didn't take too kindly to this and essentially sued them. But they kept operating, and they kept operating because they knew that this was an unfamiliar service to people. Right? People are used to getting in licensed cabs, and there is this sort of safety aspect that we are told for generations. Right? We are. Even as children, we're told not to get into cars with strangers, and here Uber is saying, please get into a car with a stranger. So this is an unfamiliar service for most people, but they knew that if they could undercut the prices of existing cabs and keep operating, they could get customers slowly. Right? So they kept on operating, avoiding bylaw officers, and where they were fined, they simply paid them on the part of the drivers in an effort to not lose customers or drivers. The existing cab industry, of course, did not take kindly to this. They responded by saying, of course, Uber is operating illegally. They are not adhering to any of the same rules that we must. They are, and even though they are, they've been banned or there's fines against them or whatever, the city is not doing enough to actually control Uber. So we see lawsuits from the cab industry in Toronto, San Francisco, and Boston, and we see protests in Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, and Toronto. The overall message here is that Uber is simply unfair to existing operators within the cab marketplace. At this point, Uber steps up its lobbying efforts. Its lobbying efforts were, at this point, headed by David Plouffe, who in a previous time was Barack Obama's campaign manager during his successful 2008 presidential campaign. So they hired some pretty heavy hitters to get them into some of these marketplaces. Two of our cities stand out, Washington, D.C. and Mexico City. Here, they didn't respond negatively to Uber. So in Washington, Uber launches there in December 2011. And within a year, council passed something called the Public Vehicle for Hire Innovation Amendment Act, which labeled Uber as a digital dispatcher. What's unique about the Washington marketplace is the degree of fragmentation amongst the existing cab industry. There is no cap on licenses in Washington, D.C. So the cab drivers there are used to people coming and going from the industry, right? If you want to drive a cab there, you can purchase a license from the city. I think it costs about $300 or whatever. So people aren't invested to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. So you're certainly taking business away from existing cab drivers, but you're not devaluing a license that they are potentially mortgaged to, right? So you aren't ruining a very expensive asset for them, right? So they were used to some degree of fragmentation there. Now there was some protests from drivers, but the reaction certainly wasn't on par with anything that we saw in any of our other cases. Mexico City, on the other hand, has a licensed cab fleet. In fact, Mexico City is serviced by the largest fleet of taxis in the world, over 140,000 registered cabs. Now, with this market, of course, comes a bit of challenges, right? So Uber enters in July 2013. It's joined by a company called Cabify, which is a service similar to Uber and based out of Spain. And after both companies enter, the cab industry argues that they are losing about 24 million pesos per day, which is equivalent to about $1.3 million US. The head of government there, and I should note there's some unique institutional arrangement in Mexico City. The mayor, so the city is somewhat like a city-state, and it has state-level powers. The mayor is called the head of government and has similar powers to a governor. So they have a little bit more authority than a typical mayor would. But the head of government there saw an opportunity. 140,000 cab drivers presents a very chaotic cab marketplace. There were still concerns about danger, about bandit cabs, tourists being assaulted, robbed, stuff like this. There was certain stories of violence between different cab companies who were trying to drive certain firms from the marketplace. They're using violence and other tactics to accomplish that. So Mexico City's cab marketplace was fairly chaotic. The head of government there looked to Uber as somewhat of a stabilizing presence, right? That the technology that Uber was using presented a degree of safety, right? That you know who was in which car, where they were driven to, who was driving the car, stuff like that. So the app provided certain safety features that the existing taxi market just could not offer. So the head of government there basically created a meeting with Uber, Cabify, and the existing cab firms and agreed on a regulatory path forward. And as of July 2015, Uber is licensed as a private chauffeur service. So in all of these cases, Uber is now legal, licensed, and regulated. So the question that we are trying to answer, of course, is how did this happen? And we've have some preliminary answers here. So to us, it all really depends on the attitude that Uber enters a market with and the response from the local government. So if we start up here with what we call collaboration, this is specifically the two cases that I just mentioned here. Uber enters a market and seeks a cooperative relationship with existing regulators. And if those regulators view Uber as complementary, we get collaboration. Right? Mexico City saw them as something that is beneficial. Right? It can bring order to a somewhat chaotic cab marketplace. In Washington, D.C., already have a pretty fragmented taxi market, right? So any additional cab companies could probably bring some benefit to consumers, right? Cheaper rides, perhaps, better services, who knows, right? So they view them as being complementary to the marketplace. When Uber enters the market with a sort of confrontational attitude or a confrontational strategy, but the government views them as being complementary. Let me back up a second. When Uber enters with a sort of confrontational strategy and encounters resistance from local political actors, what we usually get is something called political mediation. So the existing bylaw officers do not like Uber. Perhaps certain councillors see them as being disruptive. But you find certain political champions, namely in the form of mayors. Right? We get what we call political mediation. So in New York City, for example, Michael Bloomberg was a huge champion of Uber. Right? He wanted to be the innovation mayor, right? And he thought, we don't want to be seen as being behind the times. So he was a real champion for Uber. Same with Rahm Emanuel in Chicago. Again, he thought this was something that was beneficial. In Toronto, John Tory basically said, this is going to happen. This is the future, right? So we have to figure out a way to incorporate Uber into this existing market. So in this case, Uber needed some sort of local political champion, right? So if Uber has this confrontational strategy and doesn't find a local political champion, things get moved up a bit, right? Uber is big into venue shopping. Right? And if it can't find a local supportive mayor, it can't find local supportive council, it moves things up usually to either state regulators or the governor. Right? So we found this in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, and Atlanta. In Boston, for example, the mayor and council didn't view Uber as being anything that was beneficial or helpful. So as a result, they just outright banned it. Uber found a champion, however, in Governor Deval Patrick, who really pressed the city to legalize it, and then actually introduced a bill at the state level to legalize Uber statewide. It also helped that his campaign manager for his successful campaigns as governor was David Plouffe. Who was also their head of lobbying. So people said there was a bit of a connection there. In any case, that certainly helped them out. So to us, this is where kind of the real kind of policy disruption happens, right? Because regulating the taxi industry is something that's always been solely in the control of local governments. When we get to at this stage, the decision moves up, and authority in this particular policy area is weakened at the local level. So in a way, it's sort of a autonomy disruptor as well, right? This last box here, where Uber tries to be cooperative, but they're seen as being when they're seen as being a disruptive force, and they can't find any champion at all, we get local prohibition. So none of our cases fit this particular situation. So with that, this is where we are with Uber. They have an intense lobbying strategy, and they've really benefited from the fragmentation in the regulatory framework. Right. So certain other industries that were at one point seen as being disruptive, they usually have to face one regulator. So things like satellite TV, right? They had to face the FEC, and they went back and forth for years. They had one regulator. Uber benefits from having many. So if they don't like what's happening in Austin, they can move to Boston. If you don't like what's happening in Boston, you can bug the governor and hope the governor does something for you, right? So you can venue shop a lot more than if you were satellite TV or something along those lines, right? Or margarine or something like that, right? So with that, I probably talked a little too long, and so I'll leave it there and open the floor up to questions, concerns, comments. Again, this is a project that we're still working on a bit, so if anyone has any comments or any feedback, we certainly welcome them. So thank you again, appreciate it.
So yeah, questions? So Martin and then...
All right. So thanks for a great presentation. It's a fascinating topic. Can you go back to the slide before?
Sure, this one here?
Yeah. I mean, this is really kind of the meat and potatoes what you found so far. I would be curious, I mean, one thing that strikes me about this, and I know this is based on just 10 cases, but teaching local government administrators and sort of keeping an eye on this, I think that some of these patterns, I've seen them play out in other cases too. And one thing that's notable is that, as the political mediation box especially suggests, it seems that in many places, political leaders are more apt to get on Uber's side than administrators, than regulators. And I was wondering if you get into some of the potential reasons why that is, some of the mechanisms driving that in the paper. I have some theories myself, but it would be interesting to see whether you address that, because I think it may give us quite an interesting window into sort of political administrative dynamics at the local level and the different kinds of, I guess, incentives or pressures that administrators versus politicians respond to when they are faced with this kind of disruptive new entry into a regulated market.
Sure. So we talk about this a bit in the paper, and we agree. It's just something that's fascinating, right? For the most part, we found that administrators are prone to simply apply the existing bylaws as they are. So when they confront something like Uber, they say, well, this does not look like a taxi, does not look like a taxi dispatch service. So since it does not conform to the rules that we have in front of us, and since they are unwilling to conform to those rules, the reaction is almost uniformly negative, right? They say, listen, this and I think part of that is that they understand that this is controversial. I think a lot of bylaw and licensing staff, they understand, I think, to a degree better than a lot of us who are simply observers of this. They understand how invested some of these existing cab companies and cab operators actually are. Because I mean, in some cities, you have to log the whole transaction when you sell a license on the aftermarket, right? You get to log that sale, and so some of them see like, you've paid $400,000 for this license, right? And that's investment backed by nothing but a council decision, right? So I think there is a lot more sympathy from them than you would get from politicians who are a bit more detached from certain constituents. So mayors, we found, are a lot more sympathetic to Uber, but we found certain councillors are big sort of cab people, right? And they talk about fairness and this and that. And some are just they dig their heels in, and certain ones, are recognize that this is a system that is being disrupted by Uber, but they want to get the best deal for cabbies. So in certain jurisdictions, we've seen this play out in a number of different ways. So in Australia, there's two state governments where they set up a compensation fund for taxi drivers. So there's a surcharge on every Uber ride. I think it's something like 10 cents, and that goes into a fund. And cab drivers can return their licenses and get up to, I think it's $400,000 back for it, right? So they can sort of divest themselves from this, right? So we've seen some innovation, but it kind of depends on the sort of level of sympathy. I'm not sure if that answers the question or not, but it's a component of this.
Chris,
So, when I look at the table, I wonder, does the super strategic relationship actually matter? Because it may produce 4 different types of processes, but in 3 of the boxes, the outcome is the same. Uber wins. So I wonder, actually, does it really matter what Uber's position is? Is it really about government perceptions, which are independent of what Uber does? So that's the first question. The second question is, are the outcomes produced by those 3 different processes the same? Because if they're not, then who cares, right?
Yeah, fair.
Is there a variation of 3 boxes?
Fair, yeah. first onto the question, Uber wins. So Uber, 9 times out of 10 wins, right? They get what they want, but there is a degree of win. So, and certainly in some markets, Uber loses. They simply can't crack them, and Uber doesn't simply want to have access to a market. They want to have access to it on their own terms. So, for example, if you go to Vancouver right now and try to order an Uber, it's not there, right? In certain markets, they lose. Now, whether that's a temporary loss or not is something else. Anyways, but there is a variation to how they are allowed market access. So for them, they want to come into a market and have the lowest transaction costs for drivers, right? Drivers and passengers, right? So most of the regulations that cities impose have to do with drivers, right? So they want driver training, they want cameras in cars, decals, stuff like this. The average length of a Uber driver's career is 12 hours. So I think most people try it and they do it for a couple of shifts or whatever, and then they don't do it again, right? But they need all those drivers on those sort of 12-hour lifespans, right? So for them, if they get market access, but all these drivers have to do 35 hours of training, that's a huge disincentive to even try the service, right? So there's degrees of wins, right? So how is that reflected in this table? So 3 of these boxes here are represent Uber's wins, right? But they all take different amounts of time, and there's different contexts, which admittedly the table does not capture. Okay, if you need to go to the state level, there's additional costs for that, right? There's costs for lobbying and everything else, but there's also a loss of time where you could be able to legally operate within a marketplace, right? What they usually find now is that they enter and nothing is even said about it, right? This initial resistance was from some of these larger cities. So now it's like you don't want to be a city that doesn't have Uber because every other major city in the world has Uber, right? It looks kind of odd. In fact, when we talk about Vancouver, the Chamber of Commerce there, right, has said, this is a huge hindrance for tourists, for conferences, stuff like this, right? The city's losing business because we don't have Uber, right? Because everyone else has it. So I think the difference here is really kind of length of time, right? You really kind of want this, right? This is your sort of second option. This is sort of the last option, right? Again, these are all wins, but the degree matters. The table, I think, picks up some of that context, but not all of it.
I'm wondering how you selected your 10 cases,
Mm-hmm.
and also whether the answer to that question has anything to do with the fact that there's no entries in the top right-hand box.
So we select the cases based on the top 10 alpha cities. So there's a city ranking service, there's the alpha cities, beta cities, right? And there's certain qualities that alpha cities possess that others don't, right? Some of these factors like robust economies, stuff like this, but for the most part, alpha cities are usually thought of as the biggest cities. So we went out and said, let's just see what's going on in these 10 largest cities. So we didn't pick any based on what we knew about the outcomes. Obviously, some of them, we know what's happening in Toronto because it's close to us. We had no idea about Washington or Mexico City. So we literally just sort of went out there and said, let's start looking and let's start with the top 10. The top 10 allowed us to examine a number of different institutional contexts, Mexico City and Toronto, along with eight U.S. cities.
And what about the top right-hand box?
None of our cases actually conform to that, so that's why there's So with that said, I mean, if we purposely picked case studies, I can think of a few that would certainly populate that box, but just none of our case studies did, right? So think of like places like Vancouver, Austin, Calgary for most of its history until recently. So there are a few out there that where we do wind up with this, and it usually is sort of this kind of standoff between Uber and the city. Sure.
Oh, so I just wanted to follow up on a couple of things. So first on Carol's question and just about kind of the table up here, because I guess, and my familiarity with all these cases isn't the best, but and I know this is only based on your 10 case studies, but it seems like some cases would also fall out of this table, like it wouldn't be captured by this table. I don't know what happened exactly in BC, but I feel like either in BC or Alberta it was the province. Right, so it was state intervention, but it went the other way. Yeah.
So over time, so it's why I kind of start off by saying it's sort of like a snapshot, because Uber is this moving target in terms of a research subject. So yeah, certainly, if we were to examine this at different periods of time, yeah, we would see a bit of moving around. So this is the initial entry point, right? So yeah. Things would shift if we looked at sort of a longer period of time.
And then kind of following up to maybe what Chris's question was. So in these two bottom squares here, the political mediation and state intervention, are you seeing any kind of differences in terms of the policy responses, like how deep they go maybe? I had a student who wrote a very good paper on Toronto's bylaw, and so she wants to remain anonymous, I think, so I won't say who she was, but what she found was that entrance of Uber and then the decision that we're going to regulate Uber ended up having a huge effect on how the city deals with kind of taxi cabs in general, because the city was kind of paying to train taxi drivers, like running training for taxi drivers. The city was actually running garages where the taxis would have to go and get their repairs. So there was a huge shakeup in terms of how the taxi industry was regulated in Toronto, brought on by Uber, but these were things that kind of just happened incrementally over time. And so I'm wondering if you would see that kind of policy response in these other places where it's kind of like the state saying you got to let Uber operate. So did they go in as much detail, or was it just state legislation that allowed it to happen?
So in most cases where Uber becomes legalized and it's welcomed, usually after some sort of period where there's a bit of debate about this, there usually is some concessions to the existing cab industry, right? So certain aspects become loosened, right? So like the reporting requirement for vehicles is usually lengthened, right? In some cases every 3 months or whatever. Now it's like every year, right? The nature of driver training is one thing. Like it used to be done with the city. Now I think it's done through Seneca College or something along those lines, right? So in a way, regulators have sort of divested themselves of some of the procedural stuff that they used to apply to taxis. So there is usually some concession, right? We see more of that at the local level, right? So when we get to here, right? And this is a decision made by a local council. There's usually a bit more of a concession given to taxi drivers. This is usually not something that is welcomed by the taxi industry, right? I think they would probably like to just be regulated the same way as Uber, right? But at the state level, these are usually bills that just deal with Uber, right? And they don't sort of loosen any sort of existing regulations for cab drivers. So, for example, in Massachusetts, Deval Patrick acts on this. He applies pressure for several months, trying to get Boston Council to do something. Like he's just arguing this is the future. You got to do something. Act right now. They don't. So he acts, and essentially says that Uber is allowed to operate statewide. The reaction from Boston was to change the rules on existing cabs. So there is some consideration of the cab industry, but we really only see that locally. We don't see that at the state level.
A couple of things you Carol's question and then the other, the last question. Talked about some municipalities wanting to have Uber just so that they're seen as kind of come of age. They've got Uber, they're in the modern age. But that's a perception as opposed to a reality of what service is. And just hearing some of your answers to the last question, I wonder, and it wasn't a direct intent of your research, but was there any benefit either to service in these municipalities or to the regulation? Did they have, after having gone through this process, have a better regulated taxi industry after that?
Well, so just on the issue here about better regulated taxi industry, it's in the eye of the beholder to a certain degree, right? I mean, I think a lot of cab drivers at one point probably saw a lot of these regulations as being quite onerous, and I think once Uber came, they viewed them more as being necessary, right? So it depends on kind of what side you're on. I think what Uber's entry has made a lot of people in the sort of bylaw world kind of think about is that maybe we've seen a lot of this work without the need for the city to kind of intervene, right? That Uber kind of operates without us, really kind of doing much. And I think a lot of them can say, well, this is probably sufficient, right? So I think that the sort of end result may have led people to consider the need for some of the regulation that was placed on the cab industry before. So whether it's better regulated or not is sort of in the eye of the beholder to a certain degree. But he asked a few other things there as well. Sorry, I'm sort of blanking on your other questions as well.
At the end of the day, is the service better by having Uber entered into the cities they have and the way they have?
Yeah, I mean, as a consumer myself, I would say so. The concern for cities now, and then they're not really measuring service quality, but the sort of big concern for them is the impact of Uber on public transit, right? So and the existing road network, right? So for example, in San Francisco, they did a study noting that a lot of the problems with congestion stem back to Uber and Lyft, right? Who are driving around the city all day, but also double parking in lanes, waiting for passengers, stuff like this. There's some studies out there showing that there is quite a significant impact on use of public transit once Uber enters a marketplace, right? And there's also certain studies saying that there is, but only a certain price point, right? So when an Uber ride is comparable to a transit fare, right? So I think for most cities, they see Uber as being something that is beneficial to consumers at when we think of service levels, but there is greater concerns now for them about how this affects public transit systems in smaller places like Innisfil, right? Now Uber is the public transit system, right? So there is opportunity for certain places like that, right? They think this is the greatest thing ever. If you talk to the mayor council from up there, they're all in, thumbs up. This is awesome, best thing we ever did, right? So yeah, I think it just kind of depends.
So we're nearing 1 o'clock, so maybe the people who are tuned into the live stream might have other things on the go, so I don't know if there are any questions from them that we should... Okay. All right, so maybe time for one more question. Thank you.
Sure. I drove for Uber in Toronto for 8 months.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the issues that I had was in terms of, you said earlier, how you couldn't locate a point to those all emails. And the issue we're having with the pay is that sometimes what reflected on our phone was different from what the customer was paying. The customers were paying much higher than what they were paying us. So my question is, there's two questions. What is the sort of accountability mechanism from the municipal government to sort of ensure that the workers are being, fairly treated? I know that's not your topic, but and the second question was, I never paid any taxes on my pay. So what is the beneficiary to the local municipalities?
So when we talk about the relationship with Uber and government, one thing that I'm a quite firm believer in is that a lot of these governments, along the way, as they were allowing Uber or fighting Uber or negotiating even, they missed an opportunity to get their hands on a whole lot of data, right? Not just data about pay, about taxes, but also data about who's moving around the city, traffic patterns, also. You have these devices going around the city that they're doing a lot of really interesting traffic planning for you, and they don't really have access to that. So I think if I was Toronto, I mean, I would have said, yeah, I want access to some of this stuff, right? So yeah, you're not paying income tax on it. I think the federal government is now becoming quite aware that they have a bit of a blind spot when it comes to the platform economy. The province of Ontario negotiated a special agreement with Airbnb that they would report all of the earnings for renters of that service to the province. So the province would have some understanding of that. It's a little bit easier with a service like that because you can go through and see which units are available where. You have an address, and you can go back and say, you probably owe us, this estimated amount of taxes, even if you don't have an agreement like that. There's no public face to Uber transactions, right? So I think, yeah, there's challenges there about ensuring that drivers are being paid accurately. There's a number of different lawsuits ongoing right now about this. The California State Public Utilities Commission has sued Uber a number of different times about this. There's a class action lawsuit in California as well about the status of drivers. Are you guys contractors? Are you employees? And if you're employees, they owe benefits, right? And they owe there's to be some structure to the working environment if they are employees as opposed to contractors. So a lot of that is being sorted out in the courts, and local governments haven't really been involved too much in that. They haven't really been involved too much in the tax aspect for it a lot, because in certain cases they're not collecting income tax anyway, so for them it doesn't really matter. But I think governments at all levels missed an opportunity to really get access to a lot of Uber's data, which they are not giving away for free. Believe me, I've tried. I've asked. They said no. They're not into that. So. Yep.
Yeah, following up on his question, I guess, so I suppose we won't be seeing any class lawsuits from Canada, coming from Canada, because it kind of has to begin in the States first.
I think on the issue of independent contractors or employees, I think a lot of people are sort of waiting to see how that shakes out. A lot of the reason why Uber lost its license in London had to do with working conditions of drivers and stuff like that. So a number of other jurisdictions are trying to sort out where the employment aspect lies. I suspect that drivers in Canada may be waiting and seeing what happens there and seeing if there's a bit of a precedent. Obviously, like American law wouldn't set a precedent here in Canada, but there could be a bit of a policy shift internally with Uber. So now that Kalanick has stepped aside, he's still on the board, and this causing a bit of problems on the board, but the new CEO has to sort of settle some of these outstanding challenges, and the labor aspect is one. I suspect once the California case wraps up, there will be some movement towards having a company-wide policy about benefits and work days and stuff like that. So I think it's kind of a wait and see, unfortunately.
Okay, so yeah, we're past one. So thanks again, Zach, for an interesting presentation, and thanks you guys for your questions. So don't leave, let's not leave till all the food's gone. Stick around. We can continue this discussion kind of informally. You can meet instructors if you haven't yet, if you're a student. But yeah, do stick around for a bit, and hope we can talk then. Okay, so thanks again to Zach.
Thank you.
And we can say goodbye to the live stream.